I'm Debbie Dibs. Great to have you back on the podcast. And on this episode, I wanted to get into why I decided to wrap this entire podcast around a single core book. This podcast is called Calling Dibs. The book is called Dibs in Search of Self by Virginia M. Axline. And as soon as I get into why this book is the center of this podcast, if you're not familiar with this book, you better run out and get it. I mean, with a quickness, because if you've related at all to anything I've shared so far on the podcast, then this book was also written for you. So I first read this book in middle school, but I can't remember why. I can't remember why I read it in middle school, but I did. But in high school, I read it again for my psychology and literature class, and then again for my Psych AP class. Then in college, I read it for my child psychology class. I actually did an entire case study on a particular child while working with my university's on-campus preschool. So I kind of was tasked that semester to become my own Virginia M. Axline, but more just observing. I mean, she didn't participate too much, as you'll know if you read the book. She really let him play and explore. But I was strictly just observing, but it was interesting to kind of feel like I was in her shoes for a moment. And in adulthood, I've read this book now at least twice, just because it is so dang on beloved. I am Dibs. I feel Dibs in my heart and soul, to the point where, yes, I'm calling myself Debbie Dibs on this show. And I have to confess, I'm dating myself when I say this, but I have to confess it took everything I could not to call myself Debbie Dibson. I really wanted to go with Debbie Dibson. And if you understand why that is so funny, then you also are dating yourself. So welcome to the club. We old. So no, I did not call myself Debbie Dibson, but Debbie Dibs, because like I said, I really find myself reflected so strongly in this book. And I feel compelled to encourage you to not only read the book, but I also feel compelled to explain really why this book is so cornerstone to this podcast. And I'm going to read some lines from it and go through them. So some lines I just so strongly related to, and all of them will make more sense as I take deeper dives into my childhood abuse and trauma in these next coming up episodes. But when I share these, remember, these are the ones that strongly related to me. I'm going to actually thumb through this. How many pages are there? There are 218 pages to this book, plus the author's note. So there's 218 pages of a lot of other good stuff in here that you really can dive into and find your own quotes and your own lines and your own pieces of Dibs' journey that you're going to relate to. So I've included a link to the book, Dibs in Search of Self by Virginia M. Axline, in the show notes and on the website. So I'll be mentioning the page numbers where these lines that I'm sharing right now, where they hit me. I'm going to be mentioning the page numbers where they are found. So you can get the book too, and you can find those specific quotes. But you know what? Read it and write your own notes in the margins, because this thing is littered with underlinings and margin notes of my own. So write in the margins of your own copy by getting yours today. So here's what the first quote I wanted to share with you, because it's really going to kick off the essence of Dibs. So on page 85, Dibs' mother actually has gone to visit with Miss Axline partway through the course of his play therapy. And she shared this line. And when I read this, I felt like, oh my gosh, this is probably something my mom, my own mother, has thought a million times, but probably never said aloud. And Dibs' mom says on page 85, "From the beginning, when he was an infant, I could not understand him." And when I say that I have felt like I was this misunderstood child since birth, it's true. I've always felt like I was somebody my mom expected to be different. She expected a princess and she got a tomboy, and she's never been able to figure me out. So when I read that line, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like that is a window into my mother's mind. Then on page 38, well, I should say then because it's before, but on page 38, I'm taking you back to when Ms. Axline first met Dibs' mother, and one of the first impressions of her, one of the first thoughts of her. And this is a therapist, and she's very acutely attuned to the behaviors of other people. Okay, she doesn't overlook those kind of things and sweep them under the rug. She has no skin in the game other than to be a champion for Dibs' development. So when I think about this line that I'm about to share in here in a second, I think about how pure and honest it is. And it's something a mother never wants to hear about herself. But the purity and honesty of this reflection by Miss Axline on Dibs' mother is something that I think all of our mothers, parents, primary caregiver, whoever caused our trauma, they need to hear it. So this is what Miss Axline says about Dibs' mother on page 38. What must this woman really think and feel about Dibs and the part she played in his young life to be so terrified at the prospect of being interviewed and questioned about the situation? She could tell that while Dibs' mother had brought him there to quote unquote have him fixed, what Miss Axline is noticing, what Miss Axline is picking up on, is she's taking zero responsibility. She hasn't looked at all upon herself to see that she's played a part in this. And I know our mothers probably will never hear this. Our fathers will probably never hear this. Our primary caregivers will probably never hear this. But to them, I just want to say, to steal a line from Taylor Swift, you're the problem. It's you. And I'll say something that I've said over and over and over again that I want you to entomb within yourself. I have said over and over and over again, I did not raise myself. So these problems that I have, the PTSD that I have, it didn't come from nowhere. So I think too that my mother didn't really want to absorb the role that she played in causing my trauma. And I know this for a fact because when we tried to do family therapy, she was unbelievably resistant. The therapist asked her a question. I wish I had clocked it because it probably took her a full 2 minutes to even say a word. It's extremely uncomfortable for that woman to be called out, to be put in a position of accountability. And I would be willing to bet that you feel that way about whoever harmed you too. That when they hold the mirror up to themselves, it's frightening. And so they never do. Now, I don't know if you're a fan of Never Ending Story. That happens to be my favorite movie of all time. And if you're not familiar, long story short, this kid needs to go on this quest to save literally everything, the entire universe. And he has to go through these 3 very difficult gates. The first gate tries to kill you. Okay, all right. They're very difficult gates. But the last one is known as the most frightening of them all. And it's simply called the Magic Mirror Gate. Because, and as is quoted in the movie, people who think they're brave figure out that they're cowards. People who think that they're good find out that they're cruel. When we actually hold the mirror up to ourselves, this is not a quote from the movie. When we actually hold the mirror up to ourselves, it's frightening. And when we have put up airs and created a narrative and used our children to support that narrative, the last thing we want is to be held accountable. So when I read that line, I was like, oh boy, that is my mother in a nutshell to a T. So I'm wondering if this is the same for you. Read this book. All right, the next one I wanted to share is a bit of evidence as to the impact that this very distant relationship, this broken relationship between Dibs and his parents was causing. And this is also something I really, really related to. In therapy, I'm learning that I have some unhealthy boundaries. Gee, I wonder where those came from. I can't imagine. So what are the evidences? I don't know if that's the word, whatever. One of the pieces of evidence, that's right, that I have unhealthy boundaries is that I can't look people in the eye. I have a really hard time. I'm trying to work on it. I'm getting better at it. But on page 44 of Dibs in Search of Self, Miss Axline notices, she writes down, occasionally he would glance at me, but when our eyes met, he would immediately look away. And I have felt that so many times. I feel like I can't have people look at me because I'm afraid I'm going to see that they don't like me. This is me talking. That's not quite look. I'm afraid they're going to see that they don't like. I'm going to see that they don't like me. I'm afraid that I'm going to see the same face that I see when my mother looks at me behind closed doors. I just have always had this fear of rejection to such an incredible extent, I can't even look people in the eye. Do you relate to that? All right, the next one up is pulled from page 76. And this is when she's starting to see the evidence of who this child really is and how much brilliance and beauty within this child have been locked away. So on page 76, Ms. Axline writes, the beauty and power of this child's language was impressive. And to think that it had grown and flourished, even though it had been driven undercover into the wilderness of his anxiety by his loneliness and fear. But now, he had waded into his fear and was growing strong with the certainties he discovered. He was exchanging his anger and fear and anxiety for hope and confidence and gladness. His sadness and sense of defeat were thawing out. And let me tell you, since I finally started therapy and I'm actually facing all of these demons, this is what's happening to me. It is scary. It is frightening. It is tough to go through it, to talk about everything, to have all of these old memories bubble up and process them. It's not easy, especially when these are memories that have always told me lies about myself and they want to tell me more, and I have to beat them down and get the strength within my own sense of self to not believe them. And as I'm going through therapy, I'm slowly starting to see, as I'm wading into my fear, I am slowly starting to see that my sadness and my sense of defeat, that most importantly, my sense of defeat is also thawing out. And that is something I can't even put into words. I'm just excited to see how that feels when I get there finally. All right, so the next one up is on page 174. And it just says that Dibs was deeply involved in his search for a self, one thing at a time. And I think that's how I'm having to approach it. Because when you think about starting therapy, it can be daunting and overwhelming. And all you're thinking about is just how much crap is ahead of you to work through. All that mud, if you remember from one of the first episodes, all that mud that you have to trench through in order to come out as a winner on the other side, it can be daunting to look at. It's a big old pile of shit. But I'm telling you that you'll find yourself, if you go on that journey, and you can take it one thing at a time. It's not the entire pile that you're going to go through. It's going to be one little grain of sand at a time. But what's awesome, if you've ever seen a sand dune start to fall apart or an avalanche start to happen, You can see like the bottom layers of sand and snow. You see those kind of slowly coming away. And as they collapse, the layers above them collapse and it just starts this avalanche, this domino effect. That's kind of what it is. It's like, for me at least, it's been taking one thing off the shelf, looking at it, examining it, healing from it, and putting it somewhere else. Deleting it, putting it into the healed pile or whatever. But what's happening is it's not just about one at a time. That's what I'm realizing. There is this cumulative effect that as I take down one thing and deal with it, the next thing above it is a little less daunting and falls a little faster. So I just wanted to encourage you with that thought as well. And finally here, I wanted to share, now, I hate spoilers. If there's anything I used to argue with my son about, he used to want to spoil every movie for me. I'm like, stop it, don't talk. So I hate spoilers. So I apologize in advance. But the title is called Dibs in Search of Self. So I'm assuming that you've probably figured out that he goes on a journey, and the author wrote this book, the therapist Axline wrote this book because the journey was successful. So I hope I'm not totally spoiling this for you, but on page 200, these were the results for Dibs. And I want to read this in full, this full paragraph, because I want you to know that there's hope for you too. All right. It says, the feelings of hostility and revenge that he expressed toward his father, mother, and sister still flared up briefly, but they did not burn with hatred or fear. He had exchanged the little, immature, frightened Dibs for a self-concept strengthened by feelings of adequacy, security, and courage. He had learned to understand his feelings. He had learned how to cope with them and to control them. Dibs was no longer submerged under his feelings of fear and anger and hatred and guilt. He had become a person in his own right. He had found a sense of dignity and self-respect. With this confidence and security, he could learn to accept and respect other people in his world. He was no longer afraid to be himself. And that is the journey that I've been bringing myself on. That is the goal that I hope to achieve. I can see it happening. I can feel it happening, even though I just started therapy a few weeks ago, releasing through the journal, my written journal, releasing on this podcast, releasing through my therapy sessions, the group therapy, all the work that I'm doing. It's so that I can find a sense of dignity and self-respect, so that I can learn to accept and respect other people in my world. And most importantly, so I'm no longer afraid to be myself. It turns out, objectively, I'm pretty darn cool. And I bet you are too. So let's stop believing all the lies that were, I don't want to say beaten into us, because not all of us had physical trauma, but the lies that were shoved into us, into our heads, by those who are supposed to love us. Now, as an extra side note, Dibs has a sister named Dorothy, and she had been sent off to boarding school, and she was only like 5 during the writing of this book, but she was in boarding school, so she didn't have to deal with Dibs. It was their parents' way of letting her escape him. So in the back of my mind, as I was reading this book, I also couldn't help but wonder what sort of messages his sister Dorothy had received about Dibs, and how much those messages Dibs received from Dorothy. Because I have a sibling too. So how many messages about me did my brother receive from my mother? How many lies about who I am? How many lies about who she was and how she really treated me? Good Lord, I could go on and on and on about how he doesn't necessarily believe what she did to me. Siblings can be an extra tool that parents use against you. So just remember that, okay? A few more takeaways. It is super important to release your emotions, however you feel that works for you. So this is something that I'm understanding more and more every day as I continue to journal, as I continue to come to this microphone, as I continue to cry to my therapist. But my first major clue that this is true, that you have to release your emotions, was this 3-hour-long, very ugly cry that I had about 3 years ago to my dad, finally pouring out all the details of my childhood trauma and abuse from my mother. And the result of letting out those 40 plus years of pain. So I used to, and they're still there, but not nowhere near as bad. I used to suffer from chronic, debilitating migraines. And at that time, I had one that was going on 3 months. Guess what? It was gone the next morning. That migraine was just all that pent up trauma needing to spill out. And now my migraines are so much more manageable, barely there. It's almost a non-issue because I let out the emotions that were causing them. And now, of course, I'm journaling and podcasting, and that's helping too. Another takeaway, it is crucially super important to stay in touch with your inner child, because your inner child is your most true self. So this book, Dibs in Search of Self, the therapist Axline brings him through his journey through play therapy, allowing him to be in this room filled with all kinds of manipulatives, dolls, dollhouse, sandbox, all kinds of stuff that he could figure out and play with and create through his imagination his own world, and then express himself through his own world, through play. And I think it is so important. To this day, I am a firm believer, and I will do this until my dying day. I will stay in touch with my inner child. I have never stopped being a kid. And I know that you need to play still as an adult, simply for play's sake. Take those moments and create a space of fun, a moment of peace, and a time for you. Or a time, a moment to connect and create a memory with someone else who's involved in your play. And your play can be anything. It can be getting up and dancing silly for a few moments to a YouTube video. Or for me, my favorite play is what I call my Lego therapy. I build Lego sets and have a great time, and I focus in on something that distracts me from all the bullshit. And I play and I have fun. So I want you to stay in touch with your inner child and go back to playing. Whatever that means and looks like for you, go get a kite. Whatever it is, get your own sandbox. But remember to play and keep in touch with your inner child. So there is a link now to this book in the show notes and on the website, because I cannot express enough how much I want you to read this book. Now, on the next episode, the deeper stuff begins. I alluded to that on the last one. So the next episode, the deeper stuff begins. But I really wanted these first few episodes to create a few foundational thoughts for us to build off of and give you a chance to know my intentions with this show before I turn too much of a spotlight on my own story. I wanted to really, really make it concrete that I want you on this journey with me. And I'm sharing this, yes, in part to work out my own shit, but also to help you work out yours. And these kinds of episodes where I'm being reflective and talking about a bigger picture, they will certainly continue to be the main focus of the show. But I'm also going to start the other focus of the show with the next episode. I'm going to be finally getting into a lot of those stories from my life that people often find very hard to believe, especially when they involve my mother. And I'll be honest, there are as many triggering stories as there are purely entertaining ones. So I want you to come with me on this journey. Just proceed with caution for the next episodes. But with each one, I hope to accomplish at least one of the following. Number one, to continue my own personal release and processing. I never want those debilitating migraines ever again. Number two, to share stories with you that you can possibly relate to and know that you're not alone. Stories that encourage you to pursue your own healing and to connect with us and our community on Facebook so we can help each other with our healing and help each other know that we're not alone. By the way, I'm also doing mantras now on TikTok. And I'll start sharing some of those here on the podcast, probably starting with the next episode. I'll probably tag one on to the end so you can hear what they sound like if you haven't made it to my TikTok yet. But I'm on TikTok as Calling Dibs Podcast. So it's super easy to find me there. And I have a few up there already. And I really want you to take those mantras in. They're helping me. Honest to God, all they are my own aha moments. They're my own aha moments that I translate into mantras that I think can help you. So tune into those. And a third thing that I hope to accomplish on these future episodes is to continue to encourage you to explore the connections between your past and your sense of self. And I hope as I continue to find myself, especially through the more thought-provoking episodes, that you will journey ever closer to finding yourself. And again, if therapy is something you want to consider, you can find the link to the therapy solution that's working for me, BetterHelp, in the show notes. So now I want to end with a couple of final thoughts, also pulled from Dibs in Search of Self, that are just very encouraging for me. So as you pick up the book and read through it, you'll notice that there's a certain way that Miss Axline constantly encouraged Dibs to keep playing and engaging and expressing himself, and that it was okay and it was safe to do so. And so Dibs reiterated this with a couple of lines on, I believe it was his last session. So she reflects on that. She says, "I shall never forget those 3 lines. As I said it, I wanted it. As you said it, you wanted it. As we said it, we wanted it." I guess Dibs only wanted what we all want on a worldwide scale, a chance to feel worthwhile, a chance to be a person wanted, respected, accepted as a human being worthy of dignity. Yes, yes, and all the yeses. So I want you to know that as I said it, I wanted it. So as you say it, you want it. And as we said it, as a community, we want it. We want to call dibs and claim back our lives. So that was on page 216. And just to let you know my intentions here on this podcast, they're encapsulated on 218. And actually, these are words from Dibs himself in a letter he wrote. He closes by saying, "With sincerity and intent to act, I am sincerely yours, Dibs." So I may decide to close out every episode with that because I have sincerity, and I hope we both have intent to act, intent to put one foot in front of the other to improve our own lives and find our senses of self. And one last thought, page 115. So Dibs had his sessions on Thursdays. Now, this podcast has no specific release date. I decided that intentionally. I'm going to come to the microphone when it feels right. I'm not going to force it. I'm also not going to delay it. But every session that Dibs had was on a Thursday. He always went to see Miss Axline in the playroom and have his safe time on Thursdays. So as he was leaving one of these special playtimes and going back into his unsafe space of home, before he left, he turns back to Miss Axline, this is page 115, and he says, "Goodbye, Miss A. Thursday will come again. Every week has a Thursday." So even though this podcast has no specific release date, I want you to know that there's one to look forward to coming. I want you to know that whether it's this podcast or your therapy, future or current, or whatever bright times happen in the future, there are bright times that will happen. You just got to get through the mud. But I hope, just like Dibs and just like myself, you are on a journey of beautiful self-discovery. Until next time.